Hello, my name is Dark, and today I'd like to share with you my experience I had with my first 2 months of Blender. The main purpose of this video is to summarize and highlight the ups and downs of this experience. This will mainly consist of the resources I used, the struggles I faced, as well as how Googling knowledge for this program is really frustrating. But ultimately, since this experience is still relatively fresh, I feel like it's both a good recap for myself, as well as a good way to help others kind of speedrun the process that I had to figure out. To note, I will not really be going over any specifics in this video in terms of tools or techniques. However, I will try to link every resource that I used. I will also say a lot of specific terms or tools that I used, and those will not really be accompanied by a good visual aid, but if you have no idea what a term is, I suggest you Google it to broaden your knowledge. Also, I have a pinned thread on my Twitter with some of the resources that I used, which I will try to keep up to date. That link is also in the description. Before we start though, I do want to say one piece of advice. For years, I had wanted to get into the 3D space, mainly in the form of video creation and possibly game development. I was even considering enrolling in Full Sail University. However, for some reason I didn't take that path, and it did take a long time for me to find the right resources that ticked for me. In other words, the right timing and resources to help me get started with 3D in general. Not only that, but ultimately, I think a core principle that you should follow through a process like this is your desire to create. You should not feel pressured to create these things, and you should really create things that you want to create. It's okay to follow tutorials, but I think it's better to find tutorials to achieve something that you want for your own project. I had actually started to learn Blender because I wanted to make worlds for VRChat. However, I still have yet to make a single world. I fell in love with a lot of the tools that I could use, and I started to make things based on what I felt like. I could have some epiphany or a cool idea, and I would just hop on Blender and start to make it. It's this sort of passion-driven creation that, in my opinion, is what will make you succeed as an artist. Obviously, I don't have a lot of experience at all, and I'm still a huge noob at this, so I don't think I'm really qualified to say what success is in this field. However, I've applied this logic to a lot of things in my life, and I always find that I have the most fun and gain the most experience by doing the things I really enjoy. So, do it because it's fun. Anyways, let's get started. The first video I found that really kicked things off was how to make a custom VR world for VRChat start to finish by Spooky Ghost Boo. Spooky Ghost Boo actually made Suburban Lake House for VRChat, and I visited it, and I really like it. Even to this point, I haven't seen the Unity part of this tutorial. However, Spooky was able to introduce a lot of core Blender tools to me in a way that just made sense. For me, it was easy to follow these instructions and get to a point where I had modeled and textured some very basic things. From here, I'd come up with my first idea. I wanted to make a Japanese car shop world on the side of a mountain, which I would import into VRChat. The idea was to have a slope of a mountain, a main road, a side road which had a shop, a bunch of trees, good lighting, and sound effects, and I was even thinking about animating some cars with audio to be in the background sometimes. Plus something like baked lighting for specific times of day, or even dynamic lighting in the world. I did make some progress on this and use those core tools I learned, but ultimately this idea had me biting off way more than I could chew. I had this large idea with very little knowledge on how to get the finished result. As such, I barely finished it. However, I had learned quite a valuable lesson that I was not able to learn with anything else I'd ever done before. Even if you don't hit your goal, there's a good chance you learn quite a bit along the way. In this case, I learned quite a bit about some basic tools of Blender, some oddities of how I thought things should work versus how they actually work, as well as how to start using the shader nodes in Blender. So with this, I took this little bit of knowledge I gained and tried to move on to a new idea. There's a good chance that I can come back to this Japanese car shop idea later when I have a lot more experience. So on to the next fantastic and totally awesome idea I had, to make a meme model for someone I know. Goofy Kevin is a Twitch streamer, and their mascot, or VTuber model if you want to call it that, is a plague doctor. Here it is in 2D form, which I'd created quite some time ago in Photoshop and adapted to work with the Bongo Cat overlay program. I essentially just took a cube, merged it into a single point, and then used the extrude tool to create an outline for the X and Y of this character. This was long before I knew about the subsurface modifier with cubes, or the remesh or Dino Topo tools. I ended up mirroring it on X and Y and merged the vertices to make a mesh. I did later sculpt this a bit and then applied the same method to the mask. After this was said and done, I found a good tutorial on animating a camera and did my first official Blender animation. Oh dear God. In this case, I learned a bit more about materials, sculpting, and how to pair objects with other objects. Specifically here, I was able to bind the camera to both an empty to use as a focus point and a path to use as a virtual track for the camera. So to recap, I found a solid base tutorial, learned basic tools, and then used those tools to create two ideas I had in my head. In retrospect, I could have done this a bit faster with the new methods I learned, but we will talk about that shortly, and hindsight is 2020. My next idea was a Japanese street. If I remember correctly, I was inspired to do this because I was watching Rob CD on Twitch, and the idea sparked in my head. The idea in my head is a lot more grandiose than what I ended up making, but this project was a huge step in terms of me breaking down an idea into smaller, more manageable pieces, as well as learning a bit more technical things. It started with a plane that I shaped into a Y for a road. I added concrete walls on the sides, I subdivided and sculpted the road to have some dimension, and I added a brush model from BlendKit. Good plugin, by the way. Though I did need to decimate it quite a bit due to the absolutely insane poly count. I shaped this using proportional editing and used an array and curve modifier to have it go along one of the concrete walls. From here, I modeled a pole using a cylinder, added street lights, which I made using things like the bevel tool, shading the light cover with a slightly translucent material, and put a good point light behind it. Though I did end up making that plastic cover emissive since I couldn't really nail the plastic look of the cover. I also used the cylinder to make the mounting ring for the light. I then made similar mounting rings for the power lines. I used a pass to extrude a circle and bent it to look like power lines. I also used the vertex snap to make sure they lined up decently with the mounting rings. I also used proportional editing to make a safety mirror and added a basic material with roughness turned down and specular turned up. My favorite and most frustrating part was making the painted lines. I honestly can't tell you how I did it, but I did fiddle with the shader nodes and found the right combination of math to make the edges of this plane look worn, kind of like painted lines do IRL. I would do a little differently to have more variation, but I still love the way it came out. Throughout this, I was using tons of reference. The reference was me just Googling images for the types of things I wanted. I also tried to read up a little about Japanese architecture or road laws to determine some decisions, like whether I should add any specific signs. I also used Google Maps to look at roads in Japan for any significant markings. I did notice that this little painted Y is actually not so common in Japan, at least based on the certain prefectures that I looked at, but I added it anyways since that's the look I was going for. Sorry for this crazy long explanation, but I figured it may help give you an idea of my thought process while creating. It's more of a, I want to have X result, so how do I get that? And then I brute force Googling things. Which, by the way, you may have remembered I said that Googling is incredibly frustrating. Here's why. Oftentimes, when you try to Google for what you want, or try to use terms that already exist, it actually specifies too much, and you fall into these alternate rabbit holes that don't tell you how to do what you want. I'm not certain on how to specifically find what you want, but more often than not, I found the answers to a lot of these questions by just watching random tutorials I found. For example, no one told me that I need to enable the Node Wrangler add-on in order to use better hotkeys like Shift-T in the shader node editor. So at the very least, if you're trying to find out how to do something, try to search more vaguely. If you're trying to find a way to sculpt something better, don't look for how do I sculpt this specific thing in this specific way. Just search vaguely for sculpting tutorials and you may have a higher chance of finding a solution or a better solution for your problem. So the next thing I made was a one-off. I wanted to have a Dango sitting in a field looking at a flower. I didn't find a good flower, though I didn't feel like modeling one just yet, so I pulled a random bush. This was more of an exercise to speed create rather than nail details. It was more of a test of my own abilities, and I kind of learned ways to optimize my workflow a little. Plus, I ended up using texture painting instead of making the eyes and blush with plain objects, so that was kind of fun. Next, I tried to make an anime character, and let's not talk about that. Simply, sometimes sculpting is not great, which is interesting because a lot of anime tutorials for Blender actually have you tracing a model and then creating geometry in between those X and Y traces. I think it shows that there's a lot of different ways to achieve a result, and ultimately you can test out different ones and see what works best for you. So I did try this method of tracing and combining. I didn't get far, but I kind of like it. Also, please excuse the art that I used since it was definitely the best reference I had on hand. Oh, hey look, a thick Mr. Crab. Chronologically, definitely not skipping any projects, was my first VRChat avatar. This is where I will mention the great tutorial by Bucket's Turds on how to make a VRChat avatar from scratch. This was great because, well, obviously my first avatar wasn't great. I went in with that expectation and made a ton of progress. I made a very basic avatar with low poly count and no real other features, and I managed to make this within 3 or 4 hours, from nothing to being uploaded on VRChat. This was thanks to a lot of the experience I gained by making random things. Even though I didn't finish a lot of the previous projects, it gave me knowledge that I was able to apply here and get something made quickly. This avatar was a little broken initially, but I converted it to 2 meshes and 2 materials, which made it easier to work with at the time. If I redid it, I would probably add some more geometry to make weight painting a little easier and cleaner, plus I would merge them into a single object with 2 separated meshes. Basically, you can have 2 I had a burp, sorry. That water's kind of warm. Wow, talking is kind of exhausting on the throat. Basically, you can have 2 objects, press Ctrl J, and they are joined into a single object. You can then UV map this and paint. Granted, the overall quality would reduce depending on how you prioritize your UV map, but that's just something you'll learn as you go along. I still have barely done any UV map manipulation, and more so rely on multiple UV maps or the smart UV project method in Blender. For my next project, I took a little bit more of a step. Hopefully my video doesn't get blocked for this since it's a little bit revealing, though ultimately it's just a base model in art. But here's my first real attempt at making an avatar. I tried to make a Nanachi base from scratch using my experience of sculpting. Honestly, I am kind of surprised at how it came out. I was able to use the sculpting tools pretty well, I think, and I was able to translate a lot of reference into this avatar. Though I still didn't know about Dinotopo and Remesh, so I had joined together multiple objects using Boolean modifiers, and it had some strange results due to the way it joined and the difference in vertex density. In retrospect, maybe I could do the same thing in terms of joining, but definitely would need to use the remesh function to make the geometry more uniform. Also, it looks very uncanny due to the excessive human detail I somehow managed to add. So if I redid this, I would definitely smooth out a lot of the things and do it differently. My next and third test for a character, though not specifically VRChat, was for a really cool Twitch streamer named Spooky, whose mascot is an octopus, which is also referred to as the Retropus. It has a really cool and unique design that I wanted to try to replicate in 3D. I had the same Nanachi issues here with the mesh density, and since it was just a test, I didn't pay much attention to the texture. However, I would definitely redo this in a similar way, just with more cartoon focus on the textures to be closer to the original reference. This is mainly because you can actually do some really cool things depending on what texture coordination you use. So for example, I can probably make it look relatively 2D and limit the reflections based on the object faces and reflection angle, achieving a similar look to the 2D art, or at least in theory because I haven't tested it yet. However, the more important thing to note there is that because of my previous knowledge about shaders and geometry, especially in terms of using multiple materials on a single mesh by selecting faces, I knew I could probably test this sort of thing. So it shows that at this point, I was able to start iterating on previous knowledge and start to come up with my own ideas. All this being fueled by my desire to just create cool things with any ideas I come up with. After this, I just did a random street thing where I tried and failed miserably to create these fancy flower pot anchors for the balconies. Oh, and I learned here to double check your viewport and render toggles on objects. I kept seeing a weird artifact on the balcony metal texture, but it just turned out to be an old copy of the balcony Z-fighting with the middle texture. Also a tip, you can shift-click a collection or parent to turn off all the child objects. Next was clouds. This was actually really fun, and I went through a couple iterations. Here are some of the tutorials I found, however, the best one so far was Punch Holes in Clouds by Max Edge. This mainly taught me a shader node combination that allowed for a more dynamic and wide cloud structure that I wanted, but it also showed a good method for having clouds interact with other objects. The other cloud tutorials showed how to make a single cloud in a cube. This can work, I think, especially if you use geometry nodes on an invisible plane with the distribute points on faces node. However, I kind of wanted to do a large single cube so I could have a more complex interaction between each cloud. I really like the result I got after fiddling with it a little, as you can see here. I still have issues with creating a partly cloudy day, as trying to scale it just kind of turns it into an overcast sky. Also, it is very expensive to render in this current state, let alone any more complicated ways I can have it render. However, I am happy with this result and decided to move on to other things for now. The next thing I worked on was this random urge I had to spread an object on a curve. The best thing I came up with in this instant was railroad tracks. I actually really like how this came out. I think if you look at it quickly, it may seem complicated, but I actually just used the original method of extruding points in edit mode to make the rail, extruded it to a specific length, and then used cubes to create the rest of the rail. Once all the origins are in place, I can do an array and curve modifier on the object to extrude it along a path. This is very cool because you can just use the path to create whatever sort of rails that you want. Though what I haven't tried yet, and for good reason since it's probably really hard, is creating junctions, so these things. I'm sure you can see how this would be annoying to work with, so yeah. But otherwise, I think this was a great exercise. It taught me more about UV maps, reinforced my array and curve idea that I started with on the painted road lines, and also reinforced the idea that creating these things is just a lot of little pieces of knowledge. I was able to apply a lot of different things I learned through other projects in this one project, and it came along pretty quickly. I also rendered out two things which, while not super amazing and detailed like I may have had in mind originally, I actually like how they came out. I used a free train, flower, and bunny model, but it was cool to see these basic ideas materialize on top of something more complex that I created. The last and most recent thing that I have mostly completed is this kobold character. I was doing a D&D one-shot, which was also the first time I played D&D, and I got inspired to create the character that I made for this one-shot campaign. I was able to use quite a bit of reference from Google Images, as well as researching any specific traits about kobolds on the internet and specifically D&D-based websites. This was relatively complex for my skill level, but it did make me try a few different things. First of all, I was able to finally implement remesh and Dynatopo. These are huge features that I learned how to use from this video that explained it very well. As I said, these were incredibly useful tools as they allowed me to more freely sculpt. Dynatopo is nice because it can generate topology as you sculpt, and remesh is nice because it can keep your vertices consistent and not randomly clumped. I think there are specific times to use them. For example, I think Dynatopo is better if you're trying to add geometry, while remesh is more when you add small details to the surface or only make small additions. I'm sure you'll learn how to use them as you go along. The other headache was texturing. I was incredibly unsatisfied with texture painting mainly because of the low quality of using a single texture on the entire head. Though this was probably my fault for not changing the UV map texture size, as well as not unwrapping correctly. Though I spent a lot of time trying to unwrap and I just gave up. What I ended up doing is I segmented the UVs into the ears, horns, and face, and assigned different materials to them. I found this video that goes over more complex UV unwrapping, especially using multiple textures. I didn't really use it, but I think it's a great option. Also, I found this great tutorial where they used a black and white map to expose different textures. This was really great for quite some time. However, I quickly ran into problems as I guess trying to render 4 or more different shaders on the same object is not performant, really, so yeah. I'm currently kind of annoyed because I feel like I'm stuck between choosing texture painting or material shaders. For texture painting, I would need to find or develop good brushes and still deal with weird UV unwraps. Meanwhile, using more complex textures are great for how you can use normal maps, but come at the cost of a lot of performance, which isn't really an option when I need good performance to do the texture painting on the factor maps to mix the shaders. Anyways, that's pretty much where I'm at right now. I feel like I've only scratched the surface and that there's so much more I could do, but I do know that it will take quite a bit of time and practice to get good. I will say I have tried a lot of other things, even including drawing anime-style art in Clip Studio, and I've always done programming for a long time, but it was only Blender where I feel like I can truly iterate and feel like I'm growing. I'm really excited to see where I go from here and what I can create. I have a lot of ideas that I'd like to materialize at some point, and I would especially like to make some good-looking art, as well as eventually some short films or something that I can upload here. So thank you for watching. I would appreciate it if you tap the like button if you like the video, and since I do plan to upload more videos at some point, feel free to subscribe if you want. I do also have a Discord server if you want to hang out, and while I don't stream often, I do have a Twitch, plus a Twitter. All those things are linked in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.